So, we are now, is it working? Yes? So we are now to, does it work? No? Yeah? Okay. Okay, now we are going to start a new session about design experiences in microservices. We have a couple of papers from the same author. It is Eberhard Wolff. Eberhard is a fellow of InnoQ and it is also a consultant. He matured a lot of experience in the microservices design and development, and he wrote also books. One of this book is also should be also in your conference bag. So now we listen to Eberhard. You can start. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks a lot for having me. So I would like to talk about how you want to migrate microservices. And before I talk about how to do that, I would like to introduce a few constraints that I think apply to the migration towards microservices. So first of all, a way that you could theoretically migrate your system is a Big Bang approach, where you just take the whole system and then you make it a microservices system and you're done. I do enjoy Big Bangs. I think they are beautiful if you see them on the horizon, but I would rather not come close to them because they are very risky and they take a lot of effort, so I would rather not do that. So I would argue that you want to do a migration stepwise, and it's sort of the nature of microservices to do everything small and stepwise, so I think that's a good fit. So you should do a stepwise migration. It should not be too risky. There are many results. So first of all, you get a faster return on investment. So you invest in migrating. And if you just do a small step and you already generate a benefit from that, it means that you get a faster return on the investment of the migration. And it's easier to figure out that you change your goals and that somewhere else you get the real benefit of microservices, so you can take another step first. So I think that's one of the reasons, or one of the constraints. The other constraint is about goals. So if you think about microservices, there are a number of goals that microservices support and a number of benefits that they provide. So sort of the classical thing is to have independent teams. So if you have a large project and you have independent teams, then it's easier to tackle that project because the teams don't really have to communicate that much. There are not too many dependencies. Dependencies are also a driver for risk, so there is less risk, and so on and so on. So that's the typical reason, but there might be other ones like independent scalability. It's much easier to scale a microservice than it is to scale a deployment monolith. So that might be a different reason, and it's a completely different one. It's just a technical reason. It's not a reason about the organization at all. And there is independent deployment, so it's easier to set up in continuous delivery pipeline for a microservice than it is for a deployment monolith. And there are reasons for security, so you can add firewalls between microservices, and there are reasons such as stability, where you get independent crashes. That is to say that if a microservice crashes, it's just that one microservice and the others will still work. So there is an increased stability. If your system can deal with failing microservices, then you get more stability. And according to these goals, you should choose one of the migration approaches. So if you want to go for stability, for example, it's perfectly reasonable to introduce technologies that allow you to do that, like the Hystrix framework that is discontinued, resilience for J, or the service meshes that we heard about. Introduce them and then do some technical split, and you're done. And that's a completely different approach from what I'm going to introduce now. So first of all, think about the goals, then choose the strategy. And because the typical goal is about changeability, I want to talk about that. And the reason why this might be a typical goal is because, well, this is your typical legacy system, right? It's very complex, it's very complicated, nobody knows what's going on, there are a lot of dependencies, so you don't know how you can deal with this system. And that is why I would argue that one of the constraints is something that I call Blackbox Migration. So the idea is to understand as little of the monolith as possible, because you cannot really understand it, because it's much too complex. And you should also probably use as little of the monolith as possible because, well, it's hard to understand and it's probably using outdated technologies. So I would argue that ideally you want to get rid of the old monolith completely and try a completely different new approach. If your technology and your architecture is already great, why do you want to make such a fundamental change? I think it's inconsistent, but we can talk about that. This means that reverse engineering the monolith might be an interesting challenge, but I would rather not do it. So here's my blueprint migration approach. That is the one, if you ask me, so I want to migrate my system, how shall I do it? And I'm aiming for changeability, how shall I do it? This is sort of my blueprint, which basically means that you need to customize it and see how it fits your specific case. And as I said, we want to do it stepwise. So one thing is to migrate some part of your old system into a microservice and then repeat. And the other part is to build a part of the infrastructure and repeat that. The reason why I introduced the second thing is because otherwise you do a huge investment in a microservice environment, but you know, for the very first microservice you probably don't really need that. So it's two parallel tasks that are going on, and both of them should be incremental because we are looking for that stepwise approach. So let's talk about migrating some part into a microservice. So here's my deployment monolith. And we already heard about bounding context. So what I would try to do is I would try to identify a few bounding contexts in my deployment monolith to get an idea about the structure that this system should have. It's not the structure that it actually has. So the bounding context, the nice thing about that is that you can identify them probably from a user's perspective. It's about the functionality. It's about how the system works. This gives you a rough idea about how the system should be structured. It's probably not structured that way, but this is how it should probably be structured. And because we are talking about an iterative approach, I'm actually not too interested in a very precise list of bounded contexts and how the system works. It's just that I need to have some idea about how the system works generally. More important is, which is the first bounded context that I'm going to take, rip out, and separate in a microservice? That's the important question. So the end result in a few years, I don't care that much because I'm not sure what's going to happen in a few years and how things should be in a few years. The nice thing about this is that, well, it fits the idea of a Blackbox migration, right? I'm looking at the system from the outside. I'm not reverse engineering it. I'm not looking at the code. I'm just trying to understand how the system works from a user's perspective and take that as the basic approach. So we take our rough idea about how the system should be working. We have one bounded context. We take that and rip it out, and here it is. So this is the first step of our migration. On a PowerPoint slide, that's very easy. In real life, it's a little bit more complicated, but I guess you get the idea. This would be, a bounded context is a domain with a separate domain model. So there is a complete model with all the business logic in there. And that also means that there is a separate database schema, I would argue. Because in that domain model, there are domain models, there are domain objects or entities or aggregates like customer or item or what have you. And you will probably store them, so you should probably store them in a separate database schema. I would argue that this is sort of natural because this is how bounded contexts are supposed to work. They have a separate domain model. Storing that in a separate database is sort of natural. It also avoids a very close coupling between the old system and the new system because we don't share a database, which otherwise would lead to very tight coupling. Ideally, and Stefan, my colleague Stefan talked about this morning, ideally we should probably also integrate a graphic user interface. So if we have the invoicing, it should probably be a graphic user interface for the invoicing too, not just the logic. And he talked about that this morning. I came across a client at one point, they did that kind of migration, and I asked them, so if you migrated that bounded context, what's the benefit? And that was actually a very good question. And we continued to work there, and we basically said, well, maybe the better yet approach is to build a new bounded context. So the idea here is I have an existing system. There are new requirements. The new requirements are complex enough, and there are enough of them to justify a new bounded context. So I just built that. And the nice thing about this is that I don't need to understand the old business logic because I'm building new business logic. So that's great. No need for re-engineering. And also, I get better support from the business experts because I can talk to them and say, well, you know what? We want to build this new functionality, so how's that supposed to work? When I talk about old business logic, they are like, well, just build it the way it was. I don't care. That's a completely different conversation. So I would argue that this is probably better. And you get direct payoff because you're building a new system that has some business value, obviously. So probably there is better value to be gained there. So I would argue adding a new microservice is probably even better than doing a migration. For all of these reasons, better support by the business experts, better payoff, and so on and so on. So we have those two systems now. We have the bounded context in our new microservice. We have a separate database, and we need to do some kind of integration. Well, we need to do some integration probably on the API level. So if a request comes in, it's routed to either the new microservice or the old deployment monolith. And we probably need to do some kind of integration concerning data as well. We heard about the synchronization of data. So maybe we want to have some asynchronous events there. So we need to do that too. And the asynchronous integration, I would argue, actually leads to decoupling in the sense that processing is decoupled in time. So I do send out a message. It's eventually processed, but there is no coupling time-wise. It's not that it has to be processed right away. Can be processed at one point eventually. So that means that it's easier, for example, to deal with resilience because if one of the systems fails, well, there is just added latency to those messages and that's it. So it's easier to tackle this very fundamental problem of microservices. You might want to have a UI integration that provides pretty loose coupling. If you just have links between the old system and the new system, that's very decoupled. Probably you want to have some API integration, so we talked about that. And that's pretty much it. So the next thing that you need to do is you need to repeat. So you choose the next bounded context. And there is an interesting point here because if you look at the real projects, they actually take very long to do the migration, or the migration might actually never terminate. Which seems to be quite awkward and scary, but I would argue that's actually great news, because what that actually means is that at one point you say, I don't really want to migrate that bounded context. It's not worth it, or it's too risky. We are not going to change that code anyway, so it just stays where it is. So I think that's actually great, because you're not investing money in stuff that, well, doesn't really have a payoff. So I think not terminating in this is a great thing here. So this is the idea about migrating a part into a microservice. There is still the question around the infrastructure. So let me spend one slide on that too. The final problem, and we heard that, is you need to operate a large number of microservices at one point. And for one microservice, there is just no challenge at all. I would argue that every IPT department in the world is able to operate another system because they probably already have a few. So just adding one of them is not a big challenge. So I would argue you should probably build the infrastructure when it's needed. There is no need to do that upfront investment in a huge Kubernetes cluster if you just want to run one microservice. But there is a catch, there is a problem here, because obviously you shouldn't build it too late, right? So getting the right point in time is the challenge here. And obviously the problem is that operating 100 or 10 or 100 microservices is quite different from just one. So eventually you need to change the infrastructure. The other thing, I think that's also something that one of the reviewers of my paper pointed out, is the organizational impact, which is quite important. And I would argue that if your goal is changeability and decoupled teams, obviously microservices just enable that. It's not like we are changing the architecture and there are our independent teams. That is another thing. So you need to delegate responsibilities to the teams for the choice of technology, for a specific part of the domain, and you probably want to choose team members who actually want to support that to do the first migration. The point that I'm trying to make here is, and I think that's often forgotten, if you just copy over the architecture that Netflix or Spotify or whoever or Otto uses, that's not the point. At the end, it's just an enabler for a specific organization. So you should really think about the organizational impact, and that's the point. There are other strategies, however, due to the time constraints, I'm not going to talk about that too much. So there is the strategy that basically says, here's my organization, I cannot really change it, so I keep it, and I adjust the architecture. So if there is a UI team, I keep it. If there is a team responsible for the customer, I keep it, and I split apart their systems into my microservices. And I think that's a valid approach, because if you don't want to change the organization, if you can't change the organization because you're just a software architect, then that's what you need to do. You can do an approach where you choose new code, and new code would only be implemented in microservices. I don't really like that strategy, because it means that microservices pop up at random places, because at random places new code appears. So it's very easy to follow that strategy, but on the other hand, it's also, I think, not that great. And there is the strangler that basically says, I'm going to take the old application and strangle it, which is a very generic pattern. The approach, the blueprint approach that I just presented is one example. You might have others. The interesting part here is that the top two strategies, they actually don't talk about bounded context. So they are very different, and that's the point that I was trying to make. You need to adjust your strategy around your goals. Here is a link to another presentation that talks about a few more strategies, and I want to conclude with the remarks that, well, you need to consider the goals, so what you want to achieve with your microservices architecture. And far too often I hear, well, I do microservices because that's how architecture is done, right? And that's not really great. I think the blueprint approach is basically, as I said, what I would just use, using bounded context and the infrastructure done in parallel. You might want to add new microservices, so you probably don't want to, ideally, I wouldn't play the migration game at all. I would just add new microservices. And as I said, the blueprint approach doesn't always fit, so you need to consider the organization as well. And at the end, the migration might never terminate, which I believe is a great thing. Thanks a lot for listening. I believe we have time for some questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Okay. Here.
Thank you for an interesting talk. So you didn't say much about the identification of these bounded contexts, a topic that we already had in the keynote of Olaf. In academia, there are currently several approaches that try to come up with an automatic service cut, either by static analysis of source code or other artifacts, or by dynamic analysis at runtime.
Yes.
Do you think that holds any value, and what is your take on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because what I was trying to say here is that I would rather not try to understand the monolith, because that's very hard to understand and I don't see a lot of value in there. And I don't really have practical experience with the approaches that you mentioned. So I think one of the benefits here is that I'm basically saying I ignore the code and I take a look from the outside. And there are ways to do that, to identify bounded context. We have already heard about event sourcing. I think that's not a very that is not an approach that leads obviously to bounded context, but if you just take the functionality and you try to think about whether this part of functionality and that part of the functionality should be in one domain model, then you end up with a split of bounded context, and that is what we do in projects and also in training. So it's basically just, so here is some functionality. Shall I put it in a new domain model? Shall I put it in the same domain model? And then you have a split in bounded context. And it's actually not that very complicated to do. That is why I would prefer that approach.
Okay, thank you. There is another question.
Thanks for the talk. I was kind of curious if for instance, another alternative to split the monolith could be to exploit a bit the Conway law and simply say that change the organization, having like in small teams, and basically wait the programmers to go crazy with the current system and see if they can change. Is it something, or at least based on your experience, someone that is trying to change the way it's done by changing the organization?
Yeah, so what I said is that at least you should change the organization too. And I would actually argue if you have a very complex system, one that is done by multiple two-pizza teams, so by 100 developers or so, one decision that you need to make that you can't, well, scare away from is the split in teams and which team does what. And I would argue that this is sort of an architectural decision, because what you're saying at the end of the day is, so these people over here, they do X, and those people over there, they do Y. And as you said, Conway's law will lead to some kind of architecture afterwards. And then you also need to organize the communication. So I would argue that is at least part of a strategy. I think I'm not courageous enough to just do the migration by splitting the teams. That would be an interesting approach. It's just that I would rather have somebody else try it and get the experience.
Okay, there is another question there, but I think we finished the time. If it is not a problem, you can ask question later after the next talk. Okay, thank you, Eberhard.
Yeah, thank
you.
you.
Can start with the other talk.